This next video, what I want to discuss is Leonardo, which is one of the other Mutant Ninja Turtles, and some of his concepts. So this is his self-portrait. And the biggest thing that you have to know about Leonardo is he's one of the giants of Renaissance art, but really only produced about 20, maybe 30 works that we know of. And he also produced a series of sketchbooks. We think that he was a genius on many levels and really corresponds with what Baldassare Castiglione said about what a genius or a Renaissance person should be or a courtier should be, because Leonardo's work sort of exemplifies his abilities as a scientist, an engineer, an artist, an architect, and also a master speaker, a rhetorician, that kind of thing. And he is very well read, and he would have been completely familiar with the texts that Alberti had republished, which were the texts concerning the Vitruvius from the 1st century BCE and the Vitruvian Man, in which he exclaims that man is the measure of all things, man's proportions are the measure of all things. And that is one of the things that Platonic philosophers and Christian theologians believed as well. So all of that stuff is tied up with Renaissance humanism. And when we look at some of his major works of art, we're going to be discussing those things from those points of view. This sort of fresco, and you'll see why I say sort of, is one of the monumental pieces that everybody knows about, which is called the Last Supper. So let me just give you a little bit of context about it. Basically, it was designed to go into the dining room of the of Santa Maria della Grazia, and the monks and priests were supposed to eat with this facing them. So there's definitely a sense that you can pull up a chair and sit down and have the Last Supper meal with Jesus. Now the story, the background or context of it, really has to do with when Jesus was fleeing the Romans, and the Jewish holiday that he is sort of presiding over is called Passover. And in a nutshell, basically, he is presiding over a ritual feast called a Seder, in which the Jews would sit down, and remember, Jesus was a rabbi of the Jewish temple, and he was presiding over this ritual meal. And the ritual meal is when you take the wine and you drink it, and it's part of ritual Jewish eating. And there are these flatbreads that are sort of crackers that are called matzahs that are basically unleavened bread, which is a story from the Old Testament, from the Passover, in which when the Jews were fleeing Egypt and trying to get away from the pharaohs there, they didn't have time to let their bread rise. And what they would do then is they put it on their backs, and it baked in the sun and became crackers. So the wine and these matzahs are major elements of the meal. In other traditions, there are other foods. For instance, there's something called moror, which is basically apples and cinnamon and a little bit of honey and wine, which is supposed to represent the mortar. And then there are bitter herbs that you eat, which are the sort of the represent the bitterness of being in slavery. And then there's salt water and that kind of thing, which represents the tears. But in this instance, the wine and the crackers are the most important thing. And so what is happening is Jesus is presiding over this meal. He's sitting down, and while he's in this meal, he makes an announcement, and he says basically, one of you guys is going to betray me. And so we see a variety of expressions in this revelation. And then at the meal, he says, even though I know one of you is going to betray me, what I'd like to do is actually say, I'm aware of this, and I'm offering myself up as a sacrificial lamb. And so take the wine is my blood, and take the crackers or the bread, and that is a symbol of my body. Now, there have been multiple debates about whether or not this is a symbol or if it's actually transfigured, meaning sort of religiously or magically transformed into his wine and his body. And in the 1500s, that actually becomes a major source of debate with Martin Luther. But we won't get into that right now. Let's just call it a symbol. And for someone who's looking at it from an outside point of view, it's definitely a symbol of his body and his blood. One of the things that I want to discuss with you first, besides the context of the story and the location is I want to give you a context about the location and how it relates to the condition of the fresco itself. And so this fresco was at times really destroyed and hurt. And during the wars, when there were bombings, there was actually some walls falling down from a bombing and during World War II and that kind of thing. So this sculpture has been up against some real conditional things. At one point, you can see there's a doorway cut through the fresco itself. There were a lot of things that happened to it after it was painted. The least of all is the materials, or probably the most of all is actually the materials that Leonardo used to create it. But basically, if you look at this drawing, it kind of puts together all of the things. And what I'd like to suggest is basically there was a door that ran through it. Then people tried to restore it, didn't really understand the chemistry of what he was doing. They put curtains across it, and when they would pull the curtains back and forth, it would actually rub against the fresco, so it didn't preserve it. And then they tried to do some things, for instance, like provide central heating, which did help. But the biggest problem is the materials that Leonardo used when he painted this. What Leonardo did was he used a combination of different kinds of materials that weren't compatible, and which is surprising to me because he really understood physical sciences in quite a strong way, and he really understood how chemistry worked. So what he did was he put down a coat of lead primer to slow the drying on the fresco, and he paints it with a combination of fresco and oil paint. And also there's other kinds of chemicals and things, and I don't quite understand all of the different chemicals, but you can see that he was trying to slow it down so he could paint this image and really make it take some time with it, because when you paint with fresco, you need to do it instantly. So immediately, as soon as he started painting it, it started flaking off the walls. And what I want you to think is, have you ever tried to mix vinegar and oil together? It's water and oil. They don't mix together, and that's kind of why the fresco immediately, and so I guess fresco is the wrong word for it, but that's what everyone calls it. It immediately began to flake off and became very damaged. Now, another sort of formal point of view is that if you look at this fresco, what you can see is that there is a horizon line running through it. In the back windows behind him, there's atmospheric perspective. What I want to do is show you a diagram of how the perspective works on this and how it relates actually to Masaccio's tribute money in some ways, because the horizontal line or horizon line that runs through it and the vanishing point are meant as focusers for you. So if you look at this diagram, what you can see is I've traced out most of the lines, and what we have is a series of lines that correspond architecturally and all point towards Jesus's head. Then we have this horizon line that runs through all of the characters' heads, and the vanishing point is right behind Jesus's head. The way that Jesus is posed is actually a triangular form that um, in very many ways, like it's multivalenced. It has a lot of different kinds of symbologies or iconography associated with it. So first of all, it's a three-sided object, which represents the Trinity. It also creates this stable sort of compositional device that draws you up into Jesus's head, literally, almost like drawing in one-point perspective of a road would. So Leonardo really liked combining mathematics and linear perspective with that. He also used the horizon line running through all their heads to kind of give you a sense of who is important and who is not important, or actually who is Jesus talking about, who's going to betray him. And if you sort of notice that the horizon line that runs through it runs through all of their heads, but at the same time, it also shows one character who is below the horizon line, and he is also sort of pulling away from Jesus in a way. This figure is Judas. And the figure of Judas, even though this is badly damaged, you can actually see he has in his hand, grasping something, a sack. And the sack is actually a sack of money. And those are the coins that he was paid to give Jesus the kiss in public and betray him. So remember that Jesus does this willingly and he forgives him. And that's kind of an important idea. The last sort of perspective that I want to discuss with you, aside from the fact that it's sort of a toga party and there's a little biblical and classical references to it, have to do with the fact that you are on one side of the table and Jesus is on the other. So there's a humanism to this where it actually relates back to the viewer in the same way that we saw Masaccio trying to do in his Trinity with donors, and we also saw with Ghiberti. Then also there is this idea having to do with Renaissance humanism in which you have the figures are grouped up, all of these apostles are grouped into groups of threes. Remember, three is sort of a magic number because it has to do with the Trinity. And the other thing that these groups of three apostles, groups of threes of the apostles, and there are four groups, you'll notice that each grouping contains characters and each one of them has their own sort of reaction to what Jesus' revelation would be. And so we get to identify with each one of these characters in an emotional way as well. And the last thing is the humanistic gesture also relates to how you would react if you were Judas, or at least it gives us a sense of who Judas was. Now, one of the things that I want to discuss, because it keeps coming up, is the Dan Brown book. What is it? The Da Vinci Code. First of all, it shouldn't be called the Da Vinci Code because Leonardo was from the town of Vinci. So Leonardo da Vinci is not his last name. Da Vinci just means Leonardo from Vinci. So he should be Leonardo. It should be Leonardo's code. And the second thing is he made up all that stuff. Dan Brown is not an art historian. You won't find real factual information in that. So I just wanted to discount the book and tell you, don't believe it, okay? You can make up your own mind if you really study more in depth, but basically it's a way of him writing a really good fiction story. Some of the other things that are important or relevant in terms of understanding Leonardo also have to do with his sorts of points of view of things and his mind. And so the notebooks of Leonardo are really interesting to people, and they've done a lot of studies of it. And so this one that's come up several times in our lectures is basically a page out of his notebook that depicts how Leonardo is taking literally the ideas from Vitruvius that man's proportions are the measure of all things. So the width of the arms is equal to the height of a man, and you can transcribe him in a circle. He is sort of radially and bilaterally in some ways very symmetrical, and he kind of shows you the midpoint of the body and how these forms relate to geometric forms. So there is actually a sort of classical and mathematical and geometric kind of point of view of the human body in which God is sort of a divine scientist. God is the divine designer in some ways. Now, the other thing that we have here is sort of the idea that he is taking notes and really observing what God has designed in a rational way. And so when you look at his notebook, you'll see that Leonardo actually did something called mirror writing. Apparently he was ambidextrous, and when he wrote with his left hand, he was actually able to do reverse or mirror writing. And some people say it was like a way for him to sort of keep his books in code or in secret. There have been a lot of ideas about this, a lot of extrapolation, but basically my belief is probably he was ambidextrous and he liked writing with one hand, with his left hand sometimes, and because his brain was sort of a mirror image of itself, he was able to when he wrote with his left hand, it was actually literally almost like a dyslexic reversal of things. Some of the ideas that I also have come across as an educator is that it's possible that he had a sort of a very thin corpus callosum in his brain, which is a division between the left and the right sides. And when you study psychology, what you find is that two hemispheres of the brain work in slightly separate and different ways. I think the left-hand side does some things that are more mechanical and more rational, and then the right-hand side of the brain controls the things that are more creative, and that there's a crossing over, like the right-hand side of the brain controls the left-hand side of the body and vice versa. And what has been suggested in my studies is that he probably was using all of his brain, and it made him super smart, is the bottom line. One of the things that is really important about his notebooks is it shows really almost an empirical scientific method of looking at the mechanics of the world around him, almost in an Aristotelian way. So he literally goes against the law and goes in and manages to dissect bodies, which is highly illegal in Florence and Rome at that point in time, so that he can draw the body in a more realistic and a more accurate way. But there's also the fact that these dissections and things that he did went well beyond just simple curiosity about how to draw the muscles and the bones. He has detailed notes about how a lot of the parts of the body work and how things interrelate and how the systems work, because he's a scientist as well, and he's just curious on a very empirical and scientific level. So a lot of his notebooks express that kind of stuff as well. And people make a lot about the other things in his notebooks, which actually he was hired by several dukes, and actually the King of France, in whose arms he died, hired him to basically be a mechanic and an engineer, and that's how Leonardo saw himself. So when you look at the drawings, he does things like invent parachutes and flying machines, that the only problem with these devices is you don't have a way to actually get an engine to make the flying machines work. And I wouldn't want to try that parachute either. So a lot of his things haven't been built, haven't been tried, because he just didn't have the mechanics or an engine that would have run them. But basically, he didn't think of himself as a painter. He thought of himself more as an architect and an engineer. And he actually designed even war machines and things like that for some of the people he worked for. Now, the other thing that I think is important when we study his paintings is that he is a master technician. And what you see here is on the right-hand side is one of the most famous paintings he's done, The Virgin and St. Anne with Christ. And it shows the atmospheric perspective in the background. You have a foreground, middle ground, and background relationship. Some of the things that are kind of interesting little factoids or details is that Leonardo actually put in one of his notebooks that if you want to learn how to draw a mountain, just get a pile of rocks and use that pile of rocks, because the macro relates to the micro, that kind of thing. He also really understands the human anatomy and human form. And when you look at the cartoon on the left-hand side, which is a drawing on brown paper, he actually also did this thing where he would and this is something that happened a lot in the Renaissance and other later periods, he would hire models and he would do drawings directly from life. He would have sketchbooks, and then he would put these models together, and he would have these large things called cartoons. So one of the things that Leonardo did was he would have these large things called cartoons or preliminary drawings that were made from these models that he used. And basically what he was able to do with these drawings is almost like what we do with Photoshop. He would collage and reuse some of the figures. And the way that cartoons work, and this is how they would have made frescoes, for instance, in the Arena Chapel, is you take a big piece of paper, you do a drawing on it, and then you poke holes in it. And then you take a bag full of either chalk or charcoal and you bounce through those holes with a piece of cheesecloth. And if you're a dressmaker, you know that this process is how you mark fabric. And so you could reuse that drawing over and over again as a way to create paintings. So when you look at the painting on the right-hand side from the Louvre, do you notice that the figure of Mary, who's seated on the lap of St. Anne, almost feels like she is cut and paste and collaged on top of the lap of St. Anne? Well, that's pretty much what he did. And so the iconography associated with this is it's supposed to be like St. Anne's knowledge is flowing down through Mary and then down into Jesus and then down into us, and we are the lambs of God, and that Jesus is the good shepherd. And so those are some of the things. Now, all of that stuff relates to how he painted and how he thought about it. So let's take a look at some diagrams. What I've done here is kind of just put it all together, and you can see that Leonardo is actually the guy who came up with the term sfumato, which literally means smoke. And what he noticed was as you were looking at things in the background in the distance, there were layers of air that would interfere with your ability to see color and light. And he noticed that it become lighter and bluer and a little bit less detailed in the background. And you can see that he uses that. Then the other thing that he is doing is he gives you this stable triangular composition, which he's pretty famous for using geometry, which is both symbolic of the Trinity and also is a stable geometric form, which shows his interest in geometry as a scientist.